He vanished for nearly 2 decades, but the truth never did. What if the real danger was never the man but the system that made him disappear? The fog in South Boston didn't just hang low, it clung, like memory. You could walk 2 blocks and forget where you were, forget who you owed or who owed you. But for a boy named James Joseph Bulger, known even then by a name that felt like a warning, Whitey, it was home. The year was somewhere in the early half of the 20th century, back when the air tasted like coal and confession booths were filled before the bars even opened. His mother said he came out quiet. His father, a laborer broken by injury, said he came out with his fists already clenched. The family scraped by in a housing project on the edge of Old Colony, a place where dinner came from ration books, and you learned early to duck when voices got loud. Southie wasn't gentle. It didn't raise boys. It forged them, made of smoke and scraped knuckles, all of priests with sharp tongues and mothers with calloused hands who prayed harder than they wept. Jimmy, he wasn't Whitey yet, had 2 brothers and a growing understanding that rules didn't matter if no one enforced them. He didn't talk much in class, but he watched. The teachers said he had a temper, but it was his silence that unsettled them more. Other boys cracked jokes or threw punches, Jimmy calculated. He walked the streets with his shoulders slightly hunched, not in fear, but in readiness. He learned every alley, every escape route, every stoop where old men whispered secrets between drags of lucky strikes. By age 10, he was running errands for small-time bookies. By 12, he was stealing cars. He got picked up once, maybe twice, maybe more. The cops always let him go with a warning, not because he was innocent, but because his eyes said he didn't believe in mercy. And when people asked why he was called Whitey, he never answered. Let them guess. Let them wonder if it was about his pale hair or something colder. He wasn't a bully. He wasn't a victim. He was something in between. A ghost that showed up when it was useful, disappeared when it wasn't. The kind of kid who would carry groceries for an old neighbor in the morning, then slash a rival's tires that night. In church, he bowed his head like he meant it. But when he lit candles, it wasn't always for the living. Southie didn't make monsters, it made survivors. And some survivors learned early that fear was currency. Respect was negotiable. But power? Power was permanent. And Whitey Bulger, even as a boy, was already building a ledger of favors, of slights, of quiet promises made under breath. The fog would lift, yes, but Jimmy? He was only getting started. They called him Jimmy then. Not Whitey, not yet. Just Jimmy Bulger, the wiry kid with ice in his veins and something sharp behind his eyes. He was barely a teenager, but already the world treated him like a man. In Southie, that didn't take long. You grew up fast or you didn't grow up at all. There were no padded corners, no second chances. You got respect the hard way through pain or through fear. Jimmy chose both. He carried a straight razor in his pocket. Not flashy, not loud, just clean, silent, and final. He didn't wave it around. He wasn't stupid. But word got out, as it always does in neighborhoods where whispers travel faster than sirens. The first time he used it, it was over nothing. A shove, an insult, a look that lingered too long. The other kid ended up on the pavement, bleeding and shocked, more hurt by the coldness in Jimmy's eyes than the slice across his cheek. Jimmy didn't run. He just walked away like it was over before it started. That was the moment Southie started to change its tone around him. Older kids didn't try to muscle him anymore. Store owners watched him closer, not with suspicion but with caution. Priests mentioned his name in confessions they weren't supposed to repeat, and mothers told their sons, without saying it out loud, to stay on the other side of the street when Jimmy came walking by. He wasn't a talker. He didn't puff his chest or tell stories about what he'd done. He didn't have to. That silence became his armor. The fewer words he spoke, the more power they carried. When Jimmy did talk, it wasn't small talk, it was a decision. That made people nervous. Nervous people made mistakes. Mistakes gave Jimmy leverage. Fistfights came next. Not the playground kind, real ones. In alleys, behind bars, at night. He never fought fair. But he never had to fight the same guy twice. His hands knew how to land a punch, and more importantly, when not to. Because fear wasn't just about action, it was about anticipation. Jimmy made people anticipate. The razor came out only when it had to. But its legend worked overtime. Southie was filled with tough kids, but not all of them had the stomach for what Jimmy was willing to do. He wasn't reckless. He was deliberate, calculated, and that made him dangerous. By the time he was 15, he wasn't just surviving South Boston, he was shaping it. One cut, one stare, one fight at a time. And somewhere deep inside him, something was already whispering, there's more. This isn't the top, not yet, not even close. It started small. A boosted car, a broken lock, a night that felt more like a dare than a crime. Jimmy wasn't thinking about consequences. He was thinking about speed, about the way the engine growled when he turned the key, about how easy it had been. He and two others took it for a joyride through the back roads, headlights off, hearts pounding, Southie streetlights flashing like applause. But joyrides end. They always do. The cops were waiting by the time they rolled into Dorchester. Someone had tipped them off, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone who owed Jimmy a grudge. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the hand on the hood, the cold metal of the cuffs, the way the back seat of the cruiser felt smaller than the stolen car. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He stared at the dashboard, memorizing every crack in the plastic, like it was a test he would need to pass later. At the station, they asked questions he didn't answer. They wrote down things he didn't say. One of the older cops leaned in and told him he was throwing his life away. Jimmy looked back and said nothing, because deep down he already knew this wasn't a wrong turn. This was the road. He was sent to a juvenile detention center, not for long, but long enough to learn what it felt like to sleep with one eye open, long enough to see which kids broke, which ones got harder, and which ones didn't come back. He studied them all, took notes without writing them down, learned the unspoken rules: don't snitch, don't beg, don't cry, ever. They said he had potential, that with the right guidance, he could turn it around, maybe go back to school, maybe learn a trade, maybe stay out of trouble. But Jimmy didn't want a trade. He wanted control, power, not the kind handed out by bosses or teachers, but the kind you carve for yourself, the kind you take. When he got out, the neighborhood welcomed him back like nothing had changed, but something had. The air tasted different, time moved slower, his name held more weight. He wasn't just a kid who got picked up, he was the kid who came back tougher. The kind of kid who didn't rat. The kind of kid who might be going somewhere. The arrest record didn't scare him, it validated him. A line drawn in ink that said, "This one knows the system now." And Jimmy? He didn't fear the system. He was already figuring out how to use it. The boat ride to Alcatraz wasn't long, but it felt like a sentence in itself. Cold wind off the water, shackles tight on his wrists, the hum of engines, and the quiet dread of men who knew they weren't coming back the same. Jimmy Bulger, still young, but no longer just a street kid, was headed to the Rock. Not a myth anymore. Not a story whispered in holding cells. Real steel, real walls, real time. It was the late 1950s. The country was changing, but prison stayed the same. Hard beds, harder faces, and silence where sympathy should have been. Alcatraz wasn't for the petty or the sloppy. It was where they sent the ones who didn't scare easy, the ones who needed something tougher than bars. Jimmy fit in just fine. He kept his head down, at first. Watched, counted every guard rotation, studied who got respect and who got broken. He wasn't the biggest. He didn't need to be. In a place like Alcatraz, It wasn't the size of your fists, it was the sharpness of your mind. Jimmy's mind was already a blade. Days were slow, nights were slower. The sound of water crashing against rock filled the silence like a metronome of regret. Some men cracked. Jimmy didn't. He adapted, made himself useful, kept his distance from the desperate, offered favors quietly, knew when to keep his mouth shut, and when to let a rumor drift just far enough to cause tension without fingerprints. The guards noticed him, not just because he behaved, but because he watched them with the same cold calculation he gave to other inmates. A few asked questions. One or two even showed a weird kind of respect. They saw what was building behind his eyes. They just didn't know what to call it yet. He did time in other prisons too, Atlanta, Leavenworth, but it was Alcatraz that carved its name into his bones. He'd tell people later that it didn't bother him, that it was just a place. But even years afterward, when the fog rolled in thick over Boston Harbor, something in him would tighten. That salt air silence, that echo of chains on concrete. It never really left. He didn't waste those years. He turned them into a blueprint, made alliances, memorized behaviors, read more than most professors, learned how the federal system worked, not just the prison system, but the people behind it, the agents, the reports, the vulnerabilities. By the time he got out, Jimmy Bulger wasn't just tougher. He was smarter, quieter, more deliberate. Alcatraz hadn't broken him. It had focused him. And the world that waited on the other side of the bars? It had no idea what kind of man it was about to let loose. Inside the walls of Atlanta Penitentiary, Jimmy thought he had already seen the strangest corners of the system. But then came the offer. A doctor in a white coat, clipboard in hand, speaking soft like a salesman. Participate in a study, they said. Help science, shave time off your sentence. It sounded like a hustle, and Jimmy knew hustles. But what caught his attention wasn't the promise, it was the secrecy. They didn't call it what it was. They never said MKULTRA. They didn't say mind control. They said behavioral research. They didn't mention the letters C, I, or A. But the forms were vague, and the funding was quiet, and the doctors weren't prison staff. Jimmy agreed, not out of trust, but out of curiosity. He wanted to know what the government was really playing at. The first session was strange. The second was terrifying. They dosed him with something clear, bitter, almost tasteless, LSD, though they didn't name it then. And the walls of his mind began to melt. Time lost shape, memory bent into dreams. He saw faces he hadn't thought about in years, bloody, laughing, reaching through smoke. He floated above the cell, screamed without sound, watched the cracks in the ceiling turn into maps of streets he hadn't walked yet. Some inmates begged to stop. Others broke down completely. Jimmy didn't. He studied it. Even while hallucinating, he tried to find patterns. How long it lasted, how strong it got, how the doctors responded. They thought they were observing him, but Jimmy was observing them right back. There were questions afterward, pages of them, about emotion, memory, violence, about dreams and voices and fears. Jimmy answered carefully. Just enough truth to keep them interested, just enough lies to keep control. He wanted to see how far it went. The others called it a nightmare. Jimmy saw something different. He saw the cracks in the institution itself, the desperation behind the experiment. A government so paranoid it would drug its own prisoners in secret, looking for a way to break the human mind and rebuild it. If they could do that to him in a cell, what else might they be doing on the outside? He never forgot the way those doctors looked at him like a specimen, not a man, and he never forgave them for thinking they were smarter than he was. They thought they were changing him. What they didn't realize was that Jimmy Bulger had already made a decision. He would never be controlled. Not by drugs, not by fear, not by anyone. When he left that program, he didn't leave broken. He left with knowledge, and sometimes, in the years to come, When people asked why he could do the things he did, he'd pause for just a moment. Then he'd smile and say, "They opened a door in my head, and I never closed it." When Jimmy Bulger came back to South Boston, the streets didn't look smaller like they do for most men after a long stint away. They looked sharper, meaner, like they'd been waiting for him. But he wasn't the same kid who left with cuffs on his wrists and a chip on his shoulder. He came back lean, quiet, and unreadable. A man who'd seen the worst of concrete cages and come out colder than the stone that built them. It was the early 1960s now. The city was shifting new faces, new bosses, new rackets. But in Southie, some things never changed. The bars still smelled like stale beer and old prayers. The church bells still rang over the sound of ambulances, and respect still had to be taken, not given. Jimmy knew exactly where he fit. He wasn't coming home to settle down. He was coming back to settle the score. Word spread fast. The Bulger boy's back. The one they sent to the Rock. The one who kept his mouth shut when the heat came down. And with that reputation came doors that used to be locked. Old friends turned into foot soldiers. Old enemies started watching their backs. And Jimmy? He didn't talk much, but his silence carried the weight of everything he'd learned behind bars. How to wait, how to listen, how to strike without warning. He started small, alone here, a threat there. Nothing flashy, no headlines, but everything precise. He didn't need to kick in doors anymore. He made people open them for him. And behind those doors, deals were made, allegiances forged, weaknesses cataloged. He moved through the neighborhood like smoke filling every corner, seeping into cracks no one noticed until it was too late. Some folks hoped prison had changed him, that maybe the system had done its job. But prison hadn't been punishment, it had been preparation. The government had tried to bend his mind. All they did was teach him how to bend others. And now he was back with that knowledge, a street education layered with federal insight. There was something colder in his eyes now. He didn't smile much. He didn't joke. He watched people the way a butcher sizes up a cut of meat, measuring value, trimming fat. He had a list in his head, people who owed him, people who had forgotten him, people who needed reminding. And one by one, he started crossing off names. Jimmy didn't come home to rest. He came home to rise. And South Boston, whether it knew it or not, was already under his thumb. They just hadn't felt the pressure yet, but they would. Soon. It started like most things in Southie, with a whisper, then a laugh, then a warning. At first, it was just a nickname, Whitey. Nothing special. A nod to the pale blonde hair that never darkened with age, that made him stand out even when he was trying to disappear. But nicknames in South Boston had a way of growing teeth. And Whitey's? It became something else entirely. He never asked for it, never claimed it. But he didn't correct people either. Let them call him what they wanted. Let them build the myth. The more they talked, the less they knew. And the less they knew, the more dangerous he became. James Bulger had a past. Whitey had a purpose. By the early 1960s, Southie didn't just fear Whitey, they depended on him. He was a ghost and a guardian, a man who could make problems vanish with a nod or a knock. If you needed protection, he could provide it. If you needed someone gone, he could arrange it, but it always came with a price. And once you owed Whitey, you never really paid it off. He started dressing sharper, speaking softer, moving with that deliberate stillness that made even his silence feel like a threat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The streets did the shouting for him. Rumors became armor. Stories became weapons. They said he pulled a guy's teeth out with pliers in a back room. They said he could disappear for weeks and come back with clean hands and dirtier money. No one could prove it. But no one wanted to. The line between the man and the myth blurred fast. Friends began to call him Whitey. Enemies whispered it like a curse. The press would pick it up later, splash it across headlines like they'd discovered something new. But the streets knew first. They always do. Jimmy had learned early that fear was more powerful than fists. But Whitey understood something deeper, that identity itself could be weaponized. That if you gave people a name to fear, they'd do half the work for you. They'd surrender before the first punch landed. They'd hand over control just to avoid the idea of crossing it. Whitey wasn't born in a day. He was forged in alleys, in prison yards, in courtrooms where he sat stone-faced, while others begged for mercy. He was a product of cold streets and colder ambition. And once that name took hold, James Bulger no longer existed. Not really. From that point on, there was only Whitey. And Whitey didn't blink. Whitey didn't break. Whitey never forgot. Whitey didn't walk into the Winter Hill Gang. He slid in like fog under a locked door, quiet, unnoticed at first, until you realized he'd already filled the room. The crew was run by Howie Winter, then tough, smart, with a loyal circle of enforcers and enough rackets to keep the cash flowing and the cops guessing. They ran Somerville like a kingdom, and the Irish Syndicate had its own code, its own rhythm, its own ruthless kind of order. But even among hard men, Whitey stood out. He didn't brag. He didn't ask for rank. He earned it. Loan sharking, protection, gambling. He ran whatever they gave him with precision. No drama, no heat. Just results. The kind of results that made Howie pay attention. And when Whitey spoke, he didn't ask questions. He made suggestions, calm, measured, but with just enough edge to make it clear this wasn't a man you interrupted. Howie liked him because he was useful. The crew respected him because he wasn't reckless. And the enemies they crossed? They learned fast that Whitey played for keeps. He didn't throw wild punches or make scenes in bars. He made people disappear. Not always physically, sometimes just off the board. A threat silenced. A rival turned into an informant. A business taken without ever lifting a finger. He was learning the long game, but he was also watching Howie closely, studying his moves, his flaws, his dependencies. Whitey knew the old guard never stayed old for long, and loyalty in their world, it was just leverage in disguise. So he smiled. He played his part. He passed the tests. And all the while, he was building something behind the scenes, his own network, his own flow of money, his own loyal few who answered to him, and him alone. The Winter Hill crew had no idea they were nurturing their future replacement, that beneath the soft words and polite nods, Whitey was already thinking ahead. He wasn't there just to make money. He was there to build an empire, and empires didn't share power. Still, he paid his dues, collected debts, broke bones when needed, but always with calculation, never more force than necessary. Violence, to Whitey, was a tool, not a statement, and every bruise he left behind had a purpose, a lesson, a message. By the time the 70s rolled in, Whitey Bulger wasn't just a trusted hand in the Winter Hill Gang. He was its heartbeat, and the quiet whispers in the back rooms said what Howie didn't want to admit. Yet Winter had the title, but Whitey held the future. Whitey always understood that fear could open doors, but money kept them open. By the early 1970s, he wasn't just a street boss anymore. He was a quiet architect of influence, one bribe at a time. While other gangsters played tough in back alleys, Whitey played smarter in city offices. He knew where the real power lived: in paperwork, in backroom deals, in a handshake that never made the evening news. City Hall wasn't a fortress, it was a marketplace, and Whitey had the currency. He funneled cash through construction projects, slipped envelopes across tables, funded campaigns with dirty money that came wrapped in clean smiles. Councilmen didn't need to know the details. They just needed to know Whitey could make their problems disappear. Permits pushed through, investigations buried, unions quieted with a nod. In return, they asked no questions. The cops were even easier. Some wanted a piece. Some just wanted peace. A little extra each month in an unmarked envelope kept eyes pointed the other way. Patrol schedules could be adjusted. Raids could be delayed. Evidence could vanish. Whitey wasn't paying for favors, he was investing in control. And the return on that investment? Untouchable status. He moved through City Hall not like a criminal, but like a king visiting his court. No flashing cameras, no loud entourage. Just a few names whispered to the right ears, and suddenly a zoning change got approved, or a rival's bar got inspected into closure. He didn't need to pull a trigger when he could pull a string. Even the FBI had blind spots when it came to Whitey. Some agents were too focused on the Italians, others too eager to believe that one good source could take down 100 bad guys. Whitey fed them just enough to keep them hungry. Names, rumors, little truths dressed up as big breakthroughs, and they rewarded him with silence. Every tip he gave was a brick in the wall around him. He knew how to speak their language, not threats, not pleading, but implication. A suggestion over dinner, a compliment that sounded innocent but came with a quiet price. He didn't need to rule the city. He just needed it to tilt in his direction when the wind blew. Whitey didn't just buy power, he became part of it, woven into the fabric of Boston's institutions, like a ghost in the wiring. You couldn't arrest him without tearing the whole thing down, and that was the brilliance of it. While the newspapers hunted gangsters in leather jackets and gold chains, Whitey wore a windbreaker and smiled at judges on the sidewalk. He wasn't hiding, he was networking, and by the time anyone realized what he was building, it was already too late. Whitey didn't hate the Italians. He respected them. But respect doesn't mean mercy, not when territory's on the table and ambition's burning through your veins. The North End had long been their kingdom, ruled by names whispered in restaurants and funerals alike. But Whitey didn't want to bow to anyone, not Gennaro Angiulo, not the old codes of Cosa Nostra. He wanted Southie secure, Somerville open, and Boston bent quietly to his will. The plan wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It was surgical. First came the surveillance, who met where, who moved what, who talked too much. Then came the whispers. He fed the feds just enough intel to stir the pot, not to protect the city, to weaken the competition. He watched from a distance as indictments landed like body blows. He didn't pull the trigger on those arrests, but he lit the fuse. For the hits that followed, Whitey stayed just as careful. This wasn't the wild bloodletting of street punks. It was calculated removal. A body here, a vanishing there. Rival bookies disappeared without a scream. Mid-level enforcers were found in car trunks or not found at all. And through it all, Whitey's name never echoed through the crime scene tape. Just silence and speculation. He didn't work alone. He had Stevie Flemmi, now cold, precise, fluent in the politics of death. Flemmi had connections. Whitey had vision. Together, they redrew the underworld map one body at a time. And while the Italians scrambled to patch holes in their shrinking empire, Whitey expanded his own. Drug trade, loan sharking, protection, his fingerprints were on everything, but never in the record books. Some alliances were made in shadows, others in smiles over coffee. He knew who to keep close and who to make vanish. And when someone crossed a line, talked too much, asked too many questions, they were gone before the city could blink. The message was always the same. Boston belonged to him now, and anyone who couldn't accept that ended up in the ground. The feds thought they were using him. They let him grow while they hunted bigger fish. But Whitey was using them right back. With every Italian boss that fell, his grip tightened. By the late 1970s, the North End was bleeding, and Southie stood untouched. The cops never kicked in his door. The press never printed his name in red. He played the game cleaner than they could see. It wasn't about chaos. It was about order, his order. He didn't need a throne or a crown, just control. And by the time the Italians realized what was happening, they were already ghosts. The purge wasn't personal. It was necessary. And Whitey? He didn't lose sleep over necessity. Boston never heard the bullets coming. They were too well timed, too precisely placed. Whitey didn't run the streets with noise, he ran them with calculation. To him, every block was a square, every crew a pawn. The city wasn't a battlefield, it was a chessboard, and the game was survival by domination. The bodies didn't pile up all at once. They appeared like punctuation marks in a message only certain people could read. A dealer found slumped behind the wheel, engine still idling. A loan shark dumped in the river, mouth taped shut. A runner taken out in broad daylight to prove that nowhere was safe. Each hit had its reason. Each death, its audience. Whitey didn't strike out of rage. He struck for clarity. The streets had rules, his rules. If you skimmed, you vanished. If you talked, you rotted. If you hesitated, you died tired. And no one ever saw it coming, because Whitey didn't need to shout. He only had to nod. His rivals tried to fight back. Small-time outfits, old friends turned threats, even remnants of the Italians who hadn't yet accepted the new order. But they brought knives to a war Whitey had already written the ending to. He had intelligence from the feds, eyes in every bar, whispers in every cell block. And more than that, he had no conscience slowing him down. The violence changed the city. People kept their heads down more. Southie kids grew up knowing not to ask questions, not to answer doors too fast. Cops patrolled but looked the other way. Journalists heard rumors but couldn't find sources who dared speak. Boston was bleeding, but the blood was quiet. It wasn't about the volume of death. It was about precision. Whitey didn't need chaos, he needed obedience. A man killed in the right alley at the right time could stop 5 others from ever stepping out of line. He didn't enjoy it. He didn't dread it. It was just the cost of order. Some say he grew paranoid, that he started killing friends before they could become enemies, that even Stevie Flemmy raised an eyebrow now and then. But Whitey saw it differently. He wasn't losing control, he was perfecting it. The fewer people who knew the full game, the better. The tighter the circle, the cleaner the silence. By the end of the 1970s, the streets didn't belong to Boston anymore. They belonged to him. And if they spoke in gunshots. Quick, final, unapologetic. He wasn't a gangster anymore. He was gravity. Everything in Boston bent around him. And if something didn't, it broke. In South Boston, there was a kind of unwritten gospel. Loyalty above all. Silence was sacred, and if a man bled for the neighborhood bled for him. Whitey didn't invent that code, but he perfected it. He ruled with fear, yes, but it wasn't the kind that made people hide. It was the kind that made them listen. He understood something most criminals never grasped. If you want to be untouchable, you don't just dominate, you provide. You make yourself necessary. So, when the rent was due and the landlord knocked twice too hard, Whitey covered it. When a widow couldn't afford the heat in January, he made sure her furnace roared like a dragon. Groceries showed up unasked. Utility bills disappeared. Medical treatment, legal help, tuition slips, all handled with quiet efficiency. No receipts, no thanks. Just a glance at the man on the corner and the knowledge that someone was watching, always watching. He wore the mask of a saint in the street and the eyes of a predator in the dark. Kids in Southie grew up knowing 2 things. The priests would bless you, but Whitey could save you. And sometimes, when God felt far away, South Boston placed its faith in the man who never missed a beat when the lights went out. Mothers who'd lost sons still whispered blessings when they saw him walk by. Old men raised a glass in his name, never loud, just enough for the air to feel heavy with respect. He didn't ask for loyalty. He absorbed it. And in return, he kept the wolves at bay. No street gangs, no outside crews. Southie didn't just survive under Whitey, it stabilized. But there was a cost. Always a cost. If you stole, you bled. If you lied, you vanished. If you cooperated with the cops, your family grieved in silence. Everyone knew the rules. And if they didn't, they learned quick. He didn't need to enforce them often. The fear did most of the work. The kindness just polished it, made it feel like something better than fear, like pride. They called it the Southie Code, not written down, not enforced by courts, but stronger than any law on paper. Whitey sat at the center of it, not as a politician, not even as a mob boss, but as something colder, something older, a keeper of balance. He wasn't loved, not exactly, but he was needed. And in a place where need outranked morality, that was enough. Enough to keep him safe, enough to keep him powerful. Enough to make South Boston look the other way while its soul was slowly traded, one favor at a time. When the end came for Howie Winter, it didn't come with sirens or shootouts. It came with paperwork and silence. In the early 1980s, indictments fell like bricks on the Winter Hill Gang, sweeping up bookies, loan sharks, and Howie himself. The FBI had done their homework. They'd built a case so tight even the best lawyers could only stall, not stop. Howie went down hard, but he went down quietly. No last stand, just handcuffs and headlines. And while the government celebrated, Whitey waited. He didn't step into the spotlight. He didn't declare himself king. He just moved into the vacuum, like water filling a broken glass. No meeting, no vote, no need. Everyone knew. Without firing a shot, he became the heartbeat of Winter Hill. The books ran through him. The muscle answered to him. The streets, already used to his name, now spoke it with finality. He didn't wear suits. He didn't toast to power. He just kept the machine running smoother, quieter, deadlier. No more sloppiness. No more attention. Whitey ran things like a ghost. Efficient, invisible, undeniable. Money flowed faster. Rivals disappeared with less noise. Even the feds, some of whom thought they had him on a leash, found themselves chasing shadows while he slipped further out of reach. The brilliance of it was that no one saw the coup, because it wasn't one. There were no bodies in alleys, no blood on bar floors, just a shift in air pressure. And suddenly, Whitey wasn't second in command anymore. He was the command, and those who questioned it, they either adapted or faded. Even Stevie Flemmi, the stone-eyed killer who had once been equal, now walked half a step behind, not because Whitey demanded it, but because even killers recognize a stronger predator when they see one. The Winter Hill Gang didn't vanish. It evolved, and Whitey was its evolution. He had taken all the lessons learned in Alcatraz, all the paranoia baked into him by LSD experiments and betrayals, all the patience honed by years of watching, waiting, calculating, and used them to become something new. He was no longer just Southie's enforcer. He was Boston's Phantom King. And the wildest part? Most of the city still thought Howie was in charge. Let them. Whitey liked it better that way. Let the name on the file be someone else's. Let the cops chase ghosts while he built an empire on silence and fear. There was no throne, no crown, just one man who walked the streets like he owned them. Because, by then, he did. Whitey never needed his name on a deed to own a building. He never needed his face in a newspaper to make the city flinch. That was the beauty of it. He was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. While other gangsters craved credit, Whitey craved silence. He understood that power wasn't about being seen. It was about being felt. Like the wind through a broken window. Like the creak of a floorboard when no one else was home. He ran rackets, laundered cash, moved drugs, and silenced rivals, all without signing a thing. If a business made money, odds were good that some of it found its way to Whitey. And yet, try to trace it back to him, and all you'd find were ghosts. Layers of fronts, names of dead men, companies that didn't exist until the day after they were needed. He could walk past a building he owned, and the clerk inside would have no idea who he was. That was the design. Every shell company, every off-the-books agreement, every handshake sealed in a parked car and never spoken of again, it all built the illusion. He wasn't a boss. He was a shadow. And the shadow ran deep. Lawyers couldn't pin him. Accountants couldn't follow him. Even the FBI, with all their files and folders, couldn't quite make the lines connect. Not without help, and sometimes, even with help, the pieces slipped away like fog before dawn. He didn't shout at his crew. He whispered. He didn't bark orders. He suggested. And yet, his word carried more weight than any courtroom gavel. If he wanted a business gone, it closed. If he wanted a man buried, the ground opened. And still, no paper, no proof, just rumor and aftermath. Whitey made himself untouchable not by hiding, but by never standing still. His phone was never in his name. His money never touched a bank. His deals were face to face, over coffee, over silence, over a look that said more than any contract ever could. Even the cops who knew he was guilty couldn't make it stick, because every time they tried, they found themselves chasing ghosts again. One layer deeper, one step slower. The phantom boss. That's what he became. Not a nickname, a warning. He was the man behind the curtain, the storm behind the silence. And the terrifying truth was this: if you felt him, it was already too late. They had walked the same streets, once bare-kneed kids with scraped elbows and Catholic guilt, chasing stickballs and stolen glances at corner girls, Southie boys, back when loyalty was thicker than blood and the church loomed over every home like a second parent. John Connolly never forgot that. And neither did Whitey. Years later, one wore a badge and the other ran the underworld. But the distance between them was an illusion, because when Connolly joined the FBI, he didn't leave Southie behind. He brought it with him, its codes, its debts, its ghosts. And when Whitey offered a deal, Connolly didn't blink. It started simple. Intel for protection. Whitey fed the feds, crumbs names, dates, whispers from the North End. Mob stuff, mostly Italian. In return, he got cover. Not just a blind eye, but a shield. Raids that never happened. Warrants that got lost. Competitors who found themselves exposed while Whitey stayed 10 steps ahead. Connolly called it strategy. Whitey called it survival. But it was more than that. It was personal. Connolly believed he was doing the right thing, cleaning up the city by working with the devil he knew. He painted Whitey as a top-tier informant, someone who'd dismantle Cosa Nostra from the inside. Headquarters in D.C. bought it. They gave Connolly room to run, and he used it to build a kingdom where Whitey was untouchable. They met in safe houses, parked cars, quiet diners. No tape recorders, no notes. Just Southie boys talking shop. One wore a suit, the other wore silence. But the rhythm between them was the same it had always been: trust without proof, loyalty without question. The other agents saw something was off, but they didn't push hard. Connolly had the numbers, the collars, the headlines. And Whitey? He had the FBI's blindfold wrapped around him like armor. It was the perfect con. Whitey got to play informant without giving up anything real. Connolly got to play hero while feeding the beast he was supposed to cage. And together, they carved out a quiet, deadly alliance. One handshake away from treason, one whisper away from collapse. The Connolly connection wasn't just corruption. It was a friendship that curdled into conspiracy. And it would stain everything it touched for decades. But in that moment, before the fall, it felt like destiny. Two Southie boys, rising together, one with a badge, one with a body count, and neither willing to let go of the past they shared, no matter how many bodies it cost. He never wore a wire, never testified, never sat in a courtroom pointing fingers. But make no mistake, Whitey Bulger was an informant, not the kind that cooperated to atone or flipped because of fear. No, he did it with calculation, cold, clean, and lethal. It wasn't about helping the government. It was about helping himself. They called it Operation Rat's Nest, the FBI's plan to infiltrate and dismantle the Italian mafia from the inside out. Whitey saw an opportunity wrapped in federal wool. While the Bureau thought they were using him, he was already 5 moves ahead using them. He fed them just enough, bits of intel, locations, meetings, low-level names, all real, all true, but all expendable. Sacrifices to clear his path. Each tip was a bullet aimed at his enemies, fired from someone else's gun. No fingerprints, no heat, just rivals who vanished in raids or rotted behind bars while Whitey tightened his grip on Boston's underworld. Cosa Nostra got gutted, key figures taken down, territories opened up, and Whitey moved in like smoke through cracks. The FBI thought they were dismantling organized crime, but really, they were handing it to him on a silver tray. He didn't stop there. He used the badge as both sword and shield. If someone got too bold, too loud, too close, a whisper to Connolly was all it took. And just like that, another threat was neutralized. No need for drive-bys, no messy cleanup, just a quiet arrest followed by a long, forgettable sentence. And when the Italians started catching on, when they realized someone in the shadows was feeding the feds, they looked inward, not outward. They turned on each other, digging for the mole Whitey had built from lies, infighting, suspicion, collapse. All while the true traitor smiled from Southie, untouched, untouchable. Operation Rat's Nest became his playground, a law enforcement initiative turned assassination tool. Whitey didn't just survive it, he thrived in it. The very system designed to take him down became the wind at his back. Reporters would later ask why the FBI let it happen. The truth? Some knew, some didn't. Some looked away, and some were looking right at him, smiling. But Whitey didn't care. He wasn't working with the government, he was working around it. And every time someone asked, why is he still free? The answer sat buried in a sealed folder, deep in a file cabinet, marked classified. He wasn't informing to do good, he was informing to win. And he did, over and over. With every arrest that wasn't his, with every enemy that disappeared by someone else's hand. In the end, he didn't just play both sides. He built a third one his own. And by the time they realized it, the nest was empty. Except for one rat. Still breathing, still smiling. It was a dance he knew by heart. Step in, lean close, and whisper just enough. Whitey didn't need to lie to the FBI. The truth, when served in slices, was far more useful. He fed them morsels, names of wise guys he didn't like, drop locations that no longer mattered, plans that were already rerouted. To the agents, he looked golden. A street prophet with the pulse of the underworld, but they never asked why he was always just ahead of the blood. He played them like a piano, each tip a carefully struck key and a melody of manipulation. The FBI believed they had him on a leash, but it was his hand on the collar. Every conversation with Connolly was a performance. Casual tones, knowing nods, and just enough menace wrapped in charm to keep the illusion alive. Whitey didn't inform out of guilt or fear. He informed because it was a weapon. A scalpel, not a sledgehammer. He carved out enemies with the precision of a surgeon. Rival dealers, ambitious lieutenants, anyone sniffing around his corners. He handed their names to the Bureau, and like magic, they disappeared from his world, arrested, indicted, exiled to prison cells they'd never escape. And the best part? He didn't get his hands dirty. No late-night cleanup, no bodies to bury. The government became his hit squad, armed with badges instead of bullets. And all it cost him was information he didn't need. Connolly would boast back at the office his guy was the best in the game. Always accurate, always timely. Headquarters nodded, promoted him, handed him plaques and praise. And while Connolly soaked up the spotlight, Whitey sat in the dark, pulling strings no one else could see. He fed the beast to keep it purring, but never full, never satisfied. Just enough to keep the relationship alive, just enough to keep the wolves off his porch, while he built a kingdom on sand no one dared touch. Sometimes, He even gave up innocent men, ones who wouldn't talk, ones who wouldn't fight back. Collateral damage in a chess game where he never lost his queen. If he felt guilt, he buried it deep, because in his mind, it was all survival. And survival didn't come with apologies. The irony, the very agency sworn to protect the city became the quiet engine behind its darkest empire. And Whitey? He just kept feeding it, smiling while it ate. By the time the Bureau began to question who was really in charge, the damage had already been done. The files were thick, the arrests tallied high, and Whitey still walked free because he knew something they didn't. Sometimes the devil doesn't need to wear horns. Sometimes he just knows your badge number. It was a quiet kind of vanishing. No headlines, no search parties, just a man who stopped showing up. One day he's on the corner slinging small-time intel, and the next he's a missing person no one really misses. That was how Whitey liked it. Clean. Wordless. No trail but the silence left behind. They were informants, guys who thought they could play both sides. Some whispered to the FBI about things they shouldn't have known. Others got brave, cocky even, thinking the badge made them bulletproof. But Whitey was listening too, always listening. And when the wrong name reached the wrong ear, that name didn't last much longer. Sometimes they were found what was left of them. A body in the trunk of a Buick, a hand poking from a shallow grave in Quincy. Other times, they were just gone. Not a trace, not a whisper, just a memory that faded like steam on Southie pavement. And the Bureau? They should have asked questions, should have connected the dots. But they didn't. Some agents looked away because they were blind, others because they were paid to, and some, like Connolly, knew exactly what was happening and let it happen anyway. The logic was simple. As long as Whitey kept the Italians in check and fed them steady scraps, they didn't ask where the bones came from. They didn't see the pattern. Or maybe they did and just pretended not to. Because to admit it would mean admitting they'd made a deal with something they couldn't control. It was a strange kind of justice, one that played out in warehouses and alleyways instead of courtrooms. A world where suspicion was a death sentence, and loyalty had a shelf life measured in heartbeats. And through it all, Whitey remained untouchable. He played executioner with one hand and informant with the other. If a man disappeared, Whitey always had an alibi, usually given with a straight face and a shrug. "Haven't seen him in weeks," he'd say, while the dirt was still fresh on the grave. The South Boston streets whispered names like curses. Everyone knew who was behind the vanishings. But knowing didn't mean speaking. Speaking meant joining them, becoming one of the disappeared. And so the silence held. The FBI files grew thick with redacted names and missing persons reports no one ever followed up on. And Whitey? He walked the streets like a ghost in broad daylight, smiling, watching, waiting. He didn't just rule with fear. He erased people with it. Not because it was personal, because it worked. And in that world, fear was the only law still being enforced. The ledger was never written down, but it existed etched in silence, hidden behind closed doors, buried in unmarked graves. For every tip Whitey gave the Bureau, there was a body that followed. Some were enemies, some were liabilities, some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The FBI called him an asset. But for South Boston, he was something else entirely, a butcher with a badge tucked in his back pocket. The numbers didn't lie, even if the files did. Men were dying, disappearing, turning up in car trunks with duct tape over their eyes and gunshots to the back of the head. Not in chaos, not in vengeance, but with calculation. Each one erased to keep the machine running. A machine that needed blood to stay greased. Whitey didn't just inform, he weaponized his status. The moment the Bureau labeled him protected, he understood the value of that shield. He became bolder, sloppier, even. Because he knew the cleanup crew wouldn't come for him. They'd come for the people in his way. And so the murders piled up like poker chips at a crooked table. Some victims were mobsters. But others? Bar owners who asked the wrong question. Girlfriends who knew too much. Drug dealers who forgot who ran the show. Men like Brian Halloran, who tried to come clean. Or Deborah Hussey, who thought love could protect her. They weren't just names, they were warnings. And the Bureau, whether it realized it or not, kept looking the other way. The agents who should have stopped him were too close, too compromised, too proud to admit they'd made a monster. They told themselves it was for the greater good, that dismantling the mafia justified the collateral damage. But the mafia wasn't the one burying bodies in Boston basements. It was their star informant, their golden goose. There were memos, whispers, internal doubts, but no action, no cuffs, just more blood. And every time someone brought up the pattern, the same answer came back. He's helping us. As if that absolved everything. As if that explained the stench on the streets, the fear behind every locked door in Southie. When the truth finally unraveled, years later, it wasn't the horror that shocked the public. It was the arithmetic, the balance sheet, the revelation that the government had known maybe not every detail but enough, and they had let it happen. Whitey didn't hide the cost of his empire. He left it bleeding in the alleys, floating in rivers, rotting in cellars. The FBI just called it necessary. But to the families who lost sons and fathers and daughters, there was no justice in the math. Only a question that still haunts the city. How many lives were traded for one man's secrets? And who gets to decide that price? South Boston had its own kind of cathedral. Not always with stained glass or candles, but with whispers and shadows and the quiet weight of knowing too much. In these places, Whitey kept more than power. He kept proof. He kept contingency. He kept the kind of things no one was ever supposed to find unless he wanted them to. Beneath cracked floorboards, in basements that hadn't seen daylight in decades, behind walls inside church properties no cop dared to search, lay the hidden vaults of Southie. Not official vaults, not bank vaults, but real ones. The kind made from concrete, sweat, and silence. Inside them, stacks of cash wrapped in plastic, mold growing on the edges, pistols and shotguns, wiped clean, oiled and waiting, IDs, passports, keys to lockers across the state, boxes of blackmail photos, audio reels, copies of letters never meant to surface, secrets buried in metal tins like time bombs. Whitey knew one truth above all: power fades, but leverage lasts. And every vault was leverage, on enemies, on friends, on the cops, on the feds. If someone crossed him, he didn't just send a warning. He reminded them what he knew, what he had, and more importantly, where it was hidden. Some of the hiding spots were absurd in their simplicity. A hollowed-out wall behind a confessional, a taped bundle of bills inside a cinder block, a locked freezer in a dead man's garage. No alarms, no guards, just loyalty and fear to keep the curious away. Even his closest allies didn't know where all the vaults were. That was the point. He trusted no one with the whole map. If someone flipped, the most they could give up was a corner of the puzzle, enough to cause a ripple, but never a collapse. And it worked. Every time the walls started to close in, whether from rivals, police, or a rattled associate, Whitey had something tucked away that could change the game. A bribe to be delivered, a threat to be whispered, a secret to be set loose like a fire. Years later, long after he vanished, the vaults kept surfacing like corpses after a flood. Construction crews would knock through drywall and find steel boxes packed with silence. Cops would dig behind old church walls and uncover ledgers soaked in menace. And always, the same questions followed. How many are left? Who knew? And did Whitey ever plan to come back for them? He didn't need bank accounts. He didn't need trust. What he needed, what he built, was a city full of locked doors. Some you couldn't open. Some you didn't dare to. And behind each one waited something that could still burn the world down. It was a strange kind of fame, one soaked in fear, not admiration. Whitey wasn't flashy like the gangsters on television. He didn't need gold chains or loud suits. He walked through South Boston in quiet confidence, like a man who owned the sidewalks and the silence around them. People turned their heads, not out of respect, out of survival. The whispers were everywhere. Journalists at the Globe passed around notes, building timelines that never quite made it to print. Local cops joked darkly about the ghost in Southie, but none of them laughed too loud. Even FBI agents, the ones not on his payroll, talked about him like he was a storm, unpredictable, destructive, and immune to rules. He wasn't hiding. That was the most surreal part. He sat in diners. He visited bars. He showed up at wakes and weddings and walked back out untouched. Mothers warned their children not to make eye contact. Politicians learned to keep their hands clean and their mouths shut. Lawyers buried complaints in piles of red tape. No one dared make the first move. A few tried. A prosecutor here, a detective there. But every time the case got traction, it slipped. Witnesses retracted. Files vanished. Phones rang in the middle of the night with untraceable voices suggesting they think twice. Careers were quietly derailed. Families relocated. And those who stayed knew better. Because Whitey wasn't just protected by fear. He was protected by bureaucracy. He had friends in places that didn't make sense. A badge here, a judge there. And always, the one man in the FBI who made sure the machine stayed oiled. Connolly, the childhood friend turned guardian angel in a tailored suit. The message was simple. You don't touch Whitey. Not if you want to retire. Not if you want to see your kids grow up. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a fixture, like a crack in the foundation that no one dared repair, because it held the whole house together in a crooked kind of way. And so the city held its breath. The crimes stacked up like bricks in a wall no one could climb. The bodies were buried, the money moved, and still he walked free. Not invisible, not hidden, just untouchable. It wasn't about luck. It was design. Years of strategy, manipulation, and the cold understanding that fear lasts longer than memory. He had made himself necessary, dangerous to remove, safer to keep in power. And in the quiet back rooms where real decisions got made, everyone knew the same truth. You didn't go after Whitey Bulger. Not unless you were ready to dig your own grave first. Whitey always said he hated heroin, said it destroyed neighborhoods, said it was a poison that turned proud kids into shadows. He'd tell anyone who asked that Southie was off limits, that the drug game was for cowards, that real men didn't peddle death to their own people. And for a while, some even believed him. They wanted to believe him. But behind the speeches and the scowls, behind the performative disgust, there was a system, not chaos, a structure, because while Whitey claimed to hate heroin, he never stopped it. He taxed it, controlled it, managed it like a man running a business, not a war. He didn't push the product, but he made damn sure he got a cut of every gram that moved through Boston's veins. He used buffers, low-level dealers, junkies, men with records long enough to disappear quietly. He let them take the heat, while his name never appeared in any report. And if one of them got greedy or sloppy or talked too much, he made an example of them, not just with bullets, sometimes with silence. Sometimes they just vanished. The truth was simple. Heroin brought in money, more money than bookmaking or shakedowns or stolen truckloads, and Whitey, for all his talk, was never going to leave that kind of money on the table, especially when it bought him power, silence, and more leverage over everyone around him. He ran the show like a dark priest. Dealers paid him tribute. Users feared his name. Parents cursed the epidemic but didn't dare name its architect. Southie was bleeding, and the man holding the knife was also the one offering a bandage at a price. There were stories, always stories. A kid who owed too much and disappeared. A girl who got clean, then turned up dead. A dealer caught stealing from the wrong envelope, and no one ever found the pieces. And through it all, Whitey walked like a man above it, untouched, unblamed. He gave out turkeys at Thanksgiving. He slipped money to widows. He smiled at priests during funerals for overdose victims. As if that could erase the damage, as if charity could cleanse the rot. But the streets remember, the needles remember, and the families, oh, the families they never forgot. They knew the lie. They lived it every day. Whitey didn't hate heroin. He just hated not being in control of it. And in the end, that lie may have been the most monstrous thing of all. Because he didn't just profit from pain. He managed it, packaged it, sold it, and called it protection. There was no sign on the door that said, "Pay Whitey," or else. There didn't need to be. Everyone knew. Every bartender, every truck driver, every bookie working a corner or basement operation. If you made money in South Boston, you owed a piece of it to the man who kept the streets safe from everyone except himself. Extortion wasn't just something Whitey did. It was the way he organized the world. A silent tax on life. He didn't kick in doors screaming threats. He sent someone you knew. Someone who smiled as they explained that a small monthly envelope would ensure your windows stayed intact and your knees unbroken. Maybe even your life. At first, it seemed manageable. A couple hundred here. A cut of your poker game there. But soon it bled into everything. A bar couldn't stock beer without Whitey knowing the distributor. A truck couldn't move cigarettes unless his people waved it through. Bookies couldn't take bets unless they paid for the right to breathe. If you didn't, well, the consequences didn't always come right away. But they always came. Some vanished. Some got hospitalized. Some found their dogs dead in the yard, or their mothers followed home from mass. Subtle things, but sharp enough to leave scars. And just like that, Whitey didn't need to raise his voice. The fear did all the talking. He turned extortion into something cleaner than people wanted to admit. Like dues to a brutal union. You paid, you got protection. You didn't pay, you became an example. And when people got tired of it, when they whispered about standing up, he let one of them fall hard. A beatdown in the alley. A storefront torched. A man found frozen in the harbor. And then the whispers stopped. Even those who hated him often admitted one thing: he kept order. He made sure outsiders didn't muscle in. He punished junkies who stole from their own neighbors. He handled disputes faster than any court. But it wasn't justice, it was business. Whitey didn't care about right or wrong. He cared about control. And the money? It never stopped flowing. Through envelopes and briefcases, through cash laundromats and offshore games, through the backs of bars and the basements of churches. Always quiet, always untraceable, always his. That's the part most people miss. He didn't need to be loved. He didn't need to be visible. He just needed the city to understand one thing. If money moved, it moved through him. And if it didn't, neither did you. They called him the Rifleman, and not because he played by the rules. Stevie Flemmi moved through the underworld like a man who had already made peace with hell. Calm, watchful, brutal when needed, and always ready. Where Whitey was the face that haunted South Boston's streets, Flemmi was the shadow just behind your shoulder, waiting for the moment to strike. They made a perfect pair. Whitey brought the vision. Flemmi brought the blood. Together, they ran rackets, rigged the city, and built a criminal empire that stretched far beyond the borders of Boston. They didn't just rule. They dictated terms, and no one dared to say no. Flemmi had history. He'd worked with the Italians, knew the North End, spoke their language until he didn't need to anymore. When the Winter Hill Gang rose, Flemmi didn't hesitate. He slid into Whitey's world like he had always belonged there. Cold calculation replaced loyalty. Profit replaced tradition. He understood that power wasn't about heritage, it was about who controlled the fear. The partnership worked because both men knew how to compartmentalize violence. One minute they were playing cards, sipping whiskey. The next, Someone was in a trunk with their teeth pulled out to delay identification. It wasn't rage. It was protocol. Flemmy didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just cleaned up and moved on. There were whispers, of course, that he liked the brutality a little too much, that there was something hollow in his eyes, something no priest could ever confess out of him. But Whitey didn't care. He needed someone like Stevie, someone who understood that business came first and bodies were just part of the equation. But trust in that world is always conditional, and the truth has a way of seeping through even the tightest cracks. When the walls started closing in, when indictments loomed, and the FBI's grip began to tremble, it wasn't long before secrets surfaced. Ugly ones, deep ones, and when the moment came, Stevie didn't hesitate. He flipped, sat in a sterile room and gave names, dates, places, told stories soaked in blood, not because he felt guilty, not because he wanted redemption, but because it kept him breathing. That's what loyalty meant to men like them. Not faith, not friendship, just mutual usefulness. And when that usefulness ended, so did the silence. Bodies were never just bodies in Whitey's world. They were statements. Every bullet had punctuation, every corpse left in the wrong neighborhood, every face disfigured beyond recognition, every set of teeth yanked from the jaw wasn't just about death. It was about sending a message. Sometimes the message was simple: stay quiet. Other times it whispered, switch sides, and you'll end up like this. And sometimes, especially when rivals needed reminding, it shouted, no one is untouchable. Whitey didn't kill for chaos. He killed for clarity. In his version of the city, order was built on fear, and that fear had to be maintained like a fire. Too little, and people forgot who ruled. Too much, and they scattered like roaches. So he chose his moments carefully. He orchestrated them. The bodies that showed up in trunks? That wasn't sloppy. That was theater. The ones found buried under a bridge or behind a wall, hands bound, teeth missing, that was a lesson in silence. The ones never found at all, just gone, like they never existed. That was a warning so sharp it made people vanish into obedience. And then there were the personal ones. The ones done not for business, but because someone crossed a line, betrayed a trust, stole too close, spoke out of turn. Those were colder, slower, messages sent in blood, not volume. Meant for the inner circle, meant to remind even the closest that no one was beyond consequence. The FBI may have looked the other way, but the streets didn't. They read every killing like a code. They understood what wasn't printed in the newspapers. A body left near a school meant something. A death with no witnesses meant something else. Whitey's real language wasn't English, it was fear. Carefully distributed, artfully applied. You didn't need to meet him to feel him. You didn't need to hear his name to obey his rules. All it took was one look at the news, one whispered story at the bar, one rumor that someone had gone missing after mouthing off. That was enough, because when Whitey sent a message, it never came in an envelope. It came wrapped in silence, covered in shadows, and buried where no one would dare to dig. In Whitey's world, loyalty had an expiration date, and friendship was just another word for leverage. You could drink with him, laugh with him, even bleed beside him in a backroom brawl, but the second you became a liability, you weren't a person anymore. You were weight. And weight got buried. He didn't always look you in the eye when he decided. Sometimes the order came quiet, passed like a secret through the chain. Other times, he was there in the room, calm as winter, watching the moment unfold like he was studying the weather. And then it was done. One more ghost. One less problem. Some of them had been with him since the early days. Guys who helped him climb, who fought his fights and held his secrets. But time has a way of eroding use. A man starts talking too much after a few drinks, or he gets nervous about an indictment and hints at cutting a deal. Maybe he just saw something he shouldn't have. Maybe he didn't even know what he saw. Didn't matter. Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't betray. Sometimes, the cruelest part wasn't the killing. It was the lie before it. Whitey would flash that cold smile, clap a shoulder, promise everything was fine, and then later, someone's wife would be calling the police, someone's kid would be waiting at the door, and no one would ever find the body. Because it wasn't just about silencing a voice, it was about sending a ripple through the others. Let them wonder what went wrong. Let them live with the fear that they might be next. And in that fear, Whitey thrived. He called it pruning the tree, keeping the garden clean. He didn't flinch when they were people he knew. Maybe he even slept better afterward. Debts to the dead piled up in the shadows of South Boston. Each one unpaid. Each one soaked in the lie that it was necessary. But truth doesn't stay buried forever, and neither do the bones. They thought being close to Whitey meant safety. Some even thought it meant power, but they didn't know the rules, not really. In his world, closeness was a double-edged promise. You were either protected, or you were too close to let live. The women didn't always see it coming. They weren't gangsters. They weren't rivals. They were girlfriends, sisters, someone's daughter. But in Southie, that didn't matter. If you knew too much, if you talked too freely, if you loved him and then left, your name went on a list no one ever got to see. And when your time came, you just disappeared. One of them asked too many questions. Another begged him to leave the life behind. One cried when she saw something in the trunk of his car. Another threatened to go to the police. None of them screamed in the end, not because they weren't afraid, but because fear has a way of freezing the throat. He didn't kill in rage. He didn't strike without thinking. These were not crimes of passion. They were cold, deliberate deletions. Whitey saw people as chess pieces. The moment they stopped moving the way he wanted, he removed them from the board. Sometimes, he did it himself. Other times, he let someone else carry it out. Either way, the result was the same. A missing person. A family left twisting in silence, and a city too scared to ask why. You might hear whispers about one girl last seen crying outside his apartment. Another who told a friend she was going to confront him and never made it home. The police reports are thin. The leads go nowhere. In South Boston, people learned that the quickest way to end up missing was to ask what happened to the last person who did. And still, he smiled. Still, he walked the streets like a king, as if those women never existed, as if grief was just noise in the background. But the silence around their names, that's where the real violence lived. In the absence, in the rooms they never returned to, in the unanswered phones, the unopened letters, the mothers who never stopped waiting. They were ghosts long before anyone admitted they were gone, and Whitey made sure of that. It started with a hunch, then a whisper, then a name that kept showing up in places it shouldn't have. The reporter didn't set out to bring down a monster. He just wanted the story. But in South Boston, chasing truth meant stepping into a maze built out of silence, threats, and bodies that had no names left. In the quiet corners of old bar rooms and dusty court transcripts, patterns began to form. Whitey Bulger feared Gangster. Untouchable Kingpin seemed too protected, too quiet, too ghost-like for a man with so much blood on his hands. That was the crack, the hairline fracture in the myth. And once it split, everything began to fall through. What he found didn't make sense, not at first. The FBI treating a known killer like a trusted ally, names crossed out in files. Witnesses who recanted without reason. A trail of favors traded in the dark. And always, Whitey's name just outside the frame. Not innocent, just invisible. The reporter started asking questions that no one wanted asked. He pushed through slammed doors and fake smiles. He sat with men who didn't blink when they said a name out loud could get you killed. He wrote down every word. The deeper he went, the more twisted it became. This wasn't just corruption. It was something else, something sick, like a church that protects its worst priest, like a system that makes deals with its own devils. Whitey wasn't just a criminal. He was a project, a tool, a secret weapon aimed at the city's underworld. No matter how many innocent lives got caught in the crossfire, he knew they were watching him. Phones clicked, doors creaked open in the middle of the night. But it was too late to stop. He had seen it. He had heard the tremble in a retired agent's voice. He had looked into the eyes of a mother still waiting for her boy to come home. The book was called Black Mass. The title fit, because this wasn't just about crime. It was about faith twisted in the name of power, a ritual of protection for a man who deserved none. And once it was printed, the blood wasn't just on Whitey's hands anymore. The world began to look. And for the first time, the shadows where Whitey had hidden for decades began to flicker with light. It didn't happen all at once. The unraveling began as a whisper, the kind of low conversation you pretend not to hear in a federal hallway. Someone upstairs was getting nervous. The files weren't adding up. The names that should have been redacted were still there. The favors done for a ghost were too many to hide. Inside the bureau, one agent young enough to be idealistic, old enough to smell rot, started asking questions. Not loudly, not yet, but enough to raise eyebrows. He saw the names that came and went from confidential informant lists, saw how the reports always seemed to steer clear of South Boston, like there was some invisible fence no one dared cross. They told him it was classified. They told him not to ask again. That was their mistake. What began as curiosity turned into something heavier, a weight, a sense that justice was bending in all the wrong directions. He didn't know everything, not yet, but he knew something was wrong. Someone, somewhere, had made a deal with a monster, and that monster had grown fat and cruel under protection meant for patriots. The leaks started small, a document left out, a file that wasn't shredded, a phone call overheard when someone forgot to shut the door. The agent didn't even need to dig. The rot was so deep it was pushing itself into the light. And then came the rumors floating through city bars, whispered by ex-cops with tired eyes. Whitey had an FBI handler. Whitey had been tipped off more than once. Whitey had walked out of courtrooms untouched, while others disappeared forever. It wasn't just one lie. It was a system of lies, built like scaffolding around a building that never should have stood. The agent kept pulling threads. He didn't care whose suits it unraveled. And somewhere in Southie, Whitey Bulger felt it like a cold wind under the door. The streets didn't talk much, but they listened. And now they were listening too closely. Someone was asking too many questions. And worse, someone inside the bureau wasn't playing the game anymore. It would still take years. Blood would still be spilled. But this was the moment the dam cracked. The moment the silence began to echo. The beginning of the end. And Whitey, for the first time in decades, wasn't sure if the shadows could save him anymore. It hit like thunder rolling down Morrissey Boulevard. One morning in the winter chill, a headline spilled onto the streets of Boston and nothing would ever be the same. Whitey Bulger, Southie's ghost, the myth with a badge in his pocket, had been living a double life. And the bureau had been holding the mirror. The Boston Globe ran the story after years of whispers, half-truths, and locked drawers. Not speculation, not rumor, but facts. Cold, heavy, undeniable. Names, meetings, payoffs, murders. It was all there, black ink bleeding across white pages. Whitey had not only been an informant, he had been the informant. The one they protected, the one they shielded from rivals and justice, the monster they had helped create. People in South Boston read the paper with shaking hands. Some already knew, deep down. Others refused to believe it. How could the man who fed the neighborhood, who kept junk off the corners and cash in the hands of the desperate, be the rat? But it was all there. Not from his enemies, but from the Bureau's own records. from files unearthed by journalists who refused to let silence win. The exposé didn't just burn Bulger, it incinerated the FBI. Agents who'd sworn to serve the law had instead served power. They let Whitey kill, extort, vanish people into ditches and basements, and in return, he gave them crumbs. Lies wrapped in enough truth to be useful. His competition vanished, his enemies died, and he smiled for the cameras while the Bureau filed their reports. Some agents retired early. Some claimed they were just following orders. Some swore they didn't know. But Boston knew now. The city's dirtiest secret had been laid bare by ink and courage. It wasn't just a gangster story anymore, it was betrayal written into the bones of the city. And Whitey? He wasn't reading the paper. By the time the presses ran hot, he was already gone, tipped off again. Another warning from a friend on the inside. The streets were turning, the walls were closing in, and the king of South Boston had become a fugitive. But the damage was done. Trust was shattered. The myth cracked and bleeding, and for the first time in decades, the people of Boston weren't looking the other way. They were staring straight into the eyes of the truth, and it was uglier than they ever imagined. He walked into the courtroom, still carrying the weight of old loyalties, but the world he once belonged to had shifted beneath his feet. John Connolly, FBI golden boy, Southie son, and the man who once thought he could control a storm was now the one in chains. The suit fit, but the smirk didn't. Not anymore. Not when the truth finally clawed its way out of the shadows and dragged him down with it. It started quiet. A sealed indictment. Whispers from inside the Justice Department. Then the leaks grew louder, until they roared. The Bureau had protected a killer, shielded him, armed him with information, names, and silence. And at the center of that deal stood Connolly Whitey's childhood friend, handler, fixer, and enabler. The charges weren't just about paperwork. They were about blood. Prosecutors didn't care how many plaques hung on his wall. They wanted answers for the bodies buried in marshes and construction sites. They wanted to know how a federal agent could write reports with one hand and pass tips with the other. It wasn't just corruption, it was conspiracy. When the trial began, Connolly tried to spin it. He wasn't the villain, he said. He was doing his job keeping the streets safer by managing the devils. But the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence stacked high, each page heavier than the last. Wiretaps, testimonies, paper trails soaked in regret. Stevie Flemmi himself took the stand, cold-eyed and unrepentant, laying bare every dirty favor Connolly had ever delivered. For years, Connolly believed he could ride the lightning and never get struck. But the storm was patient, and now, the same system he once manipulated was swallowing him whole. The courtroom didn't care about old friendships or South Boston codes. It cared about the dead, about justice too long delayed. When the sentence came down, there was no applause, just the hollow sound of history closing a chapter. Connolly was going away, not just for leaking secrets, but for helping murder ride the rails unchecked. And as the doors of the prison slammed shut behind him, something else cracked wide open. The dam was breaking. Because if Connolly fell, who else would follow? Who else helped cover for a man who vanished informants and smiled through funerals? The facade was crumbling, and the truth was flooding out. One man down, 100 questions rising, and somewhere, far from the cameras and cold cells, Whitey Bulger was still free watching. It happened fast, so fast the city didn't even realize he was gone until the echo of his name began to bounce through empty alleys and silent phones. James Whitey Bulger, the man who once made South Boston flinch with a glance, vanished like smoke in the wind. No farewells, no flash, no last look over the shoulder, just absence. One moment he was flesh and blood. The next, he was legend. The indictment had been building quietly, stitched together from wiretaps, dead men's secrets, and the last confessions of a system trying to cleanse itself. By the time the papers were ready, the agents thought they had him boxed in. They didn't. Someone had tipped him. Maybe a badge, maybe a whisper in the hallway. But the message was clear: run. And so he did. They think he left town with his longtime companion, slipping into the maze of America like a ghost through drywall. Cameras never caught him. Credit cards never traced him. He moved like someone who had been planning it for years because he had. The moment he made his first deal with the Bureau, he also began rehearsing the exit, just in case. Just in time. He knew how the game worked. He knew every surveillance blind spot, every tailing pattern, every excuse that buys a 24-hour head start. He used his knowledge like a razor, slicing through the net before it could tighten. His stash houses had cash buried in walls, IDs with different names but familiar faces, vehicles that hadn't been driven in years. The kind of preparation that only comes from living in constant readiness. The FBI was humiliated. The headlines weren't just about what he had done, they were about what they had let him do. A mass murderer turned federal informant. A federal informant turned fugitive. The agency scrambled to save face, but the damage was done. Trust evaporated. So did leads. For years, sightings trickled in. A diner in Mississippi, a beach town in California, a quiet couple in the desert. But by the time agents arrived, the trail had gone cold. Always cold. As if he were slipping through time itself. As if Whitey had become more than a man, he had become myth. Some say he lived comfortably. Others believe he never truly slept again. Either way, one truth remained. The devil had disappeared, and no one could prove where he went. Not yet. It was the beginning of his second life. A life without shadows, because he had become the shadow. A life without chains, but never without watchers. He had outplayed the law, again. He vanished into the fabric of the country like a breath exhaled and forgotten. For 19 years, not a single confirmed sighting. No phone calls to old allies, no slip-ups at airports, no fingerprints on glass, just silence. A silence so complete it didn't feel like hiding, it felt like death. But Whitey wasn't dead. Not yet. Stories filled the void. A quiet man living near the Mexican border who paid in cash and never spoke. A couple in Louisiana who seemed too well dressed for the swamp. A loner in Europe with Boston tattoos and a sharp eye for exits. Every few months, another rumor. Every few years, another false alarm. He became folklore, America's gangster ghost. The FBI plastered his face across billboards and news bulletins, but the public stopped looking. After a while, it felt like a game they couldn't win. How do you catch a man who no longer wants to be seen? Who wears new skin, new habits, a new name? He had studied their playbook from the inside. Now he was using it against them. And he was winning. The silence became his camouflage. Every year that passed, the case grew colder. Not from lack of effort, but from the weight of time. Retired agents would speak his name with a kind of reverence, equal parts hatred and awe. How many men had outlasted both the law and the legends about them? Very few. Maybe just one. Old Southie changed in his absence. The bars he ruled were sold, the streets repaved, the rules rewritten. But in the backs of minds, in the pauses of conversations, his name lingered like unfinished business. Mothers warned their sons not to follow that path. Old-timers drank toasts to the ghost. He was gone, but he was everywhere. And still no slips, no photos, no betrayals. Not even Stevie Flemmy, locked in a cell with nothing left to protect, gave up the location. That silence, too, became part of the myth. Either Whitey had disappeared so completely no one could find him, or he had made sure no one who could would. 19 years passed. Presidents changed. Wars began and ended. But the file stayed open. A case number that collected dust, but never closed. And somewhere, out in the vastness of America, the man once called Whitey watched, waited. Or maybe, just maybe, he finally believed he was free. But silence has a cost. And time, even for ghosts, always runs out. He was always just one step out of frame. A white-haired man at a London cafe who paid in crisp American bills and disappeared before his tea cooled. A grizzled stranger in a Sicilian fishing village, fluent in English with a Boston accent too clean for coincidence. A soft-spoken couple in Uruguay, the man wearing sunglasses indoors and walking a half step behind his companion, always watching. For nearly 2 decades, the world became his mirror maze. He was seen and then not, named and then doubted. The FBI's most wanted posters became weathered wallpaper in airports and bus stations. Tourists snapped photos with them like souvenirs, never believing the man might be sitting 2 tables away. Each tip carried weight. Each new report reawakened the hunt. Agents flew across oceans. Old surveillance experts were pulled from retirement. But every lead ended the same way: too late, too vague, too convenient. It was as if Whitey had become a myth that people wanted to see. Or maybe he had simply mastered the art of vanishing while standing in plain sight. In New York, someone swore they'd seen him at a Yankees game, gray hair tucked beneath a cap, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he was daring someone to recognize him. In Dublin, a bartender recalled a regular who knew far too much about South Boston. In France, a traveler claimed to have shared a train cabin with a man who quoted Yeats and flinched when a uniformed officer passed. Each story added another layer to the legend, but underneath the myths were patterns. He always stayed near water, always lived modestly but moved with purpose, never used banks, never lingered. He didn't hide in darkness, he blended with the noise. Airports, train stations, coastal towns, places full of movement, full of strangers. He could be anyone: a retired teacher, a quiet American expat, a grandfather buying groceries with exact change. And still the sightings came, some wild, some plausible. A street musician in Barcelona claimed Whitey once dropped a 50 and whispered, "Play something old." A hotel maid in Belize said he left without checking out but left the bed perfectly made. A priest in Brazil swore he confessed to him, but left no name, only silence. Through it all, the question gnawed at those chasing him: was he slipping up, or was he playing with them? Every sighting, every face in the crowd. Maybe it was him, or maybe that was the point. Whitey didn't need to outrun the law. He just needed to stay a rumor. The paper was glossy. The numbers were big. $2 million for information leading to his capture. A face framed in shadow stared back from post office walls and gas station corkboards across the country. Some towns kept it taped up for so long, the corners curled with dust. Others replaced it every few months, like a seasonal reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. By the time the reward poster went up, Whitey Bulger wasn't just a fugitive, he was a ghost in a suit. A bedtime story with a bounty. The FBI called him armed and extremely dangerous. Locals in Southie just called him gone. Reporters loved the symmetry. The man who once ruled Boston from the shadows now lit up billboards in broad daylight. Tip lines buzzed. Theories bloomed. Strangers looked twice at elderly men in diners, wondering if this one's accent leaned a little too Irish, a little too polished. The poster didn't just offer money, it offered justice, or revenge, or closure, depending on who you were and what Whitey had taken from you. For some, it was a murdered brother. For others, a city that had been held hostage by fear and silence. Either way, the poster made him official. He wasn't just an old mobster on the run. He was public enemy number 1 in a world that had mostly forgotten how to label evil. Television specials rehashed the details. South Boston, Winter Hill, FBI informant turned predator. Dramatizations filled cable channels with reenactments and Irish fiddle music laid over gunshots. But the poster said it simplest. Wanted, James J. Bulger. Last seen in 1995. Maybe traveling with a female companion. Believed to be in possession of multiple weapons. Do not approach. They posted it in airports, on border crossings, even in casinos. They showed it in between commercials during football games. A face once feared on the streets, now watched from behind laminated plastic, stuck to the wall beside notices for lost dogs and local pancake breakfasts. And still, nothing. The money sat untouched. The face on the poster stayed the same. Only the world around it aged. Over time, even law enforcement began to admit the bitter truth. If he didn't want to be found, he wouldn't be. Not by bribes. Not by force. Not by the slow grind of time. He was too smart, too paranoid, and just lucky enough to stay a step ahead. But still, the poster remained. A silent dare taped to the world's window. Find me, if you can. Santa Monica was all sun and silence. Just a quiet stretch of ocean breeze, palm-lined sidewalks, and the kind of anonymity that only a city full of strangers could offer. And there, inside a modest rent-controlled apartment a few blocks from the beach, lived a man called Charlie. His hair was white, his back slightly stooped, and his smile practiced. To the neighbors, he was polite, private, and always paid in cash. But Charlie was just a name, a mask. Because behind the sunglasses and soft-spoken routine stood James Whitey Bulger, America's last great fugitive. With him was Catherine Grieg, loyal, devoted, smarter than most gave her credit for. She played her role perfectly, down to the smallest detail. Groceries on Thursdays, vet appointments for their rescue cats. Never too friendly, never too withdrawn. They were the kind of couple people noticed just enough to forget. The apartment was clean but sparse. No photos, no guests, a small TV. A stack of books about history, war, and organized crime, some with dog-eared pages that hinted at morbid curiosity or quiet pride. There were disguises in the closet, ID cards in different names, a bag always half-packed, just in case. But year after year, no one came knocking. The wanted posters aged. The reward money gathered dust. And Whitey, the ghost of South Boston, faded into the hum of traffic and seagulls overhead. They walked the promenade. They shared dinners at quiet cafes. They kept secrets the way others kept schedules. And all the while, the world kept looking in the wrong direction, searching through jungles, border towns, remote cabins in Canada, never once suspecting that the man on the FBI's most wanted list was feeding parking meters and tipping baristas a block from Venice Boulevard. What kept him safe wasn't a gun or a safe house. It was the banality of it all. He wasn't hiding in shadows, he was hiding in plain sight, behind a routine so boring it became invisible. He knew the rules. Blend in, don't flash cash, stay clean. No phone calls, no internet, no slip-ups. But time has its own rhythm, and even ghosts leave footprints. A dentist appointment, a neighbor who got curious, a retired agent who never really stopped hunting. One day, a tip surfaced, a match was made, and the facade began to crack. But for over a decade, he lived free, not in a jungle, not in a bunker, but in a sun-drenched apartment by the Pacific, where America's most wanted man sipped coffee each morning beside the woman who never stopped believing in him. Even monsters, it seemed, could wear sandals and walk the beach. He held the door open for old ladies. He watered the plants on the fire escape. When the building super needed help lifting a water heater, Charlie was there, wiry arms and all. He remembered names, waved at children, complimented dogs, never threw loud parties, paid rent on time, in neat stacks of cash. To the tenants of the modest Santa Monica apartment building, he was the model neighbor, a quiet, polite retiree who read history books and loved cats. No one knew that Charlie was once the nightmare of South Boston, that those same hands had gripped pistol grips, pushed shovels into frozen marsh soil, and zipped rivals into tar-stained duffels. The marshes still remember, even if the palms outside his window did not. The man who had orchestrated murders with cold precision now spent afternoons feeding birds at the park. He bought groceries with Catherine, choosing avocados with careful fingers. They played the part so convincingly, so delicately, that even the nosiest residents came to see them as just another old couple lost in a new city. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He talked about his bad back and a long life full of regrets in that tired New England accent, softened by the California air. Still, some things didn't quite fit. He never let the handyman into their unit alone. He never used credit cards. And when a new tenant asked what he used to do for work, he smiled and said, "I've lived a lot of lives." No one thought to press further. Why would they? He was generous with small favors, but cautious with information, always watching, always calculating. The irony was thick as ocean fog. The man who once made Boston tremble now blended into a city full of washed-up actors and forgotten faces. He who had filled shallow graves and ordered executions with the flick of a cigarette now volunteered to carry groceries for a neighbor who had just had knee surgery. No one asked why he never had visitors. No one noticed how he scanned every face on the street, every badge on a passing patrol car. He was a ghost in a city that didn't believe in ghosts. A man hiding in the open, disguised by age, kindness, and the quiet hum of a rent-controlled life. But behind the reading glasses and soft cardigan, behind the daily walks and good manners, lived the old predator. Waiting, watching, never quite asleep, because a man like that never really retires. He just moves downstairs, smiles more, and buries the truth a little deeper than the last body. It started like so many breaks in long-lost cases do, quiet, almost too quiet. A phone rang at an FBI field office, not in Boston, but somewhere far removed from the cold streets where this story began. The voice on the other end was calm, older, maybe female. She didn't give her name, didn't want money, just said she thought she recognized the man on the news, the one with the strange eyes and a long memory. Said he lived in her building. Said his name was Charlie. There had been so many false leads over the years, so many whispers, wild goose chases, blurry photographs. But something about this tip felt different. Maybe it was the calm in her voice. Maybe it was how she said she'd seen the scars on his hand, or how he always watched the exits when they rode the elevator together. Or maybe it was just time. 19 years is a long time to run. Even ghosts get tired. Agents pulled property records, rental agreements, utility bills. There were gaps, strange payments, alias names that didn't trace back to anyone. But the pieces began to click. The building matched. The timeline matched. And the man calling himself Charlie looked an awful lot like someone who had once topped America's Most Wanted. Surveillance teams were careful, methodical. They watched him feed stray cats behind the building. They tracked his walks, noticed how he never used a cell phone, noticed how he always glanced at license plates. A man who once moved with the brutal chaos of the Winter Hill Gang now moved with quiet paranoia. But he didn't know the game was ending. Not yet. They confirmed it with fingerprints pulled from a cup left behind at a library. A perfect match. The fugitive who had slipped through trapdoors, evaded stings, and vanished from sight for nearly 2 decades was living in plain view, just blocks from the beach. The final tip wasn't some dramatic moment out of a crime thriller. It was a phone call. A neighbor with a good memory. A tired voice on a Wednesday afternoon. The kind of break that makes old agents shake their heads and say, "It was always going to end this way." The net didn't slam shut. It tightened slowly, deliberately, like hands wrapping around a throat already half surrendered. He didn't run. He didn't fight. When the agents finally knocked, he opened the door, looked each one in the eye, and smiled. Just like that, the last chapter began. It was morning in Santa Monica, warm and forgettable. The ocean breeze was soft, the kind that carried seagull cries and the scent of coffee from sidewalk cafes. Inside apartment number 103, a man who had been a phantom for nearly 2 decades sat in a recliner, reading the newspaper the old-fashioned way. No internet, no phones, just print and memory. He knew the silence outside was different that day. The hallway didn't hum the same. The building breathed differently. Then came the knock. Not a bang, not a raid, just a knock, sharp, precise, like it had been practiced. He folded the newspaper slowly, set it down, and stood up without hurry. The woman in the other room didn't move. She already knew. Her face had been pale for days. He walked to the door like a man answering a package delivery. But behind the wood, he could hear them. Too many boots, too much breath being held. Federal agents in jackets they probably thought made them invisible. He opened the door. The man on the other side had been chasing his shadow for years. And now here it was older, thinner, wearing a white t-shirt and jeans, skin like paper but eyes just as sharp. James Joseph Bulger didn't blink. He smirked. Not because he thought he'd get away again, but because part of him had never stopped believing he was the one in control. "You found me," he said, almost amused. "Took you long enough." The agents moved in, firm but not rough. They read him his rights. He didn't interrupt. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just nodded like a man who had been waiting for this knock since the day he disappeared. 19 years of silence, of aliases and routines and constant paranoia, had come to a full stop. In the corner of the living room was a stack of books on history, military intelligence, and the Cold War. On the nightstand, a rosary. The television was off. The refrigerator held nothing but apples and bottled water. There were guns hidden behind the walls, but he hadn't reached for them. They walked him out into the California sun, the cameras already swarming. He looked up at the sky like he hadn't seen it in years, even though he lived 2 blocks from the beach. He didn't cover his face. He didn't speak again. He just walked like it was the end of a long story he'd already told himself 1,000 times. And behind the smirk was something else. Relief. Behind the refrigerator, in a hollowed-out section of the wall, was a duffel bag. Not a suitcase, not a locked safe, just a bag, heavy with the weight of a life on the run. When the agents opened it, they didn't speak at first. They just stared. Inside was cash, brick after brick, bound with rubber bands and old masking tape. The kind of green that only came from years of careful laundering and silent withdrawals. It wasn't drug money. It wasn't traced. It was survival money. Stacked together, it totaled over $500,000. Enough to start a new life anywhere. Enough to run again. Enough to vanish twice over. But he hadn't touched it in years. Maybe he was done running long before the knock came. In the bedroom closet, they found a small arsenal. Not military grade, but cold and ready. Pistols, revolvers, even a sawed-off shotgun, wrapped in an old flannel shirt. Each one cleaned, each one loaded, as if he expected the end to come not with a court summons, but with blood on the carpet. Then came the disguises, wigs, sunglasses, baseball caps, false IDs, dozens of them. Different names, different ages, different faces for the same ghost. Driver's licenses from states he'd never been to. Passports stamped with lies. A backup plan for every direction. He hadn't used most of them. But their presence spoke louder than any confession. There were photos, too, of Catherine, of beaches, of strangers he might have once known or once needed to watch. No family, no friends. Just fragments of a double life lived in silence and second-guessing. A file folder labeled "Just in Case" held a list of safe houses, code phrases, burner phone numbers. But none of it had saved him. He could have run again. He had the means, the tools, the money. But something had shifted. Maybe in his bones. Maybe in the quiet moments before sleep. Maybe it was Catherine's tired eyes. Maybe it was the weight of too many ghosts pressing in on that little rent-controlled apartment. When the FBI cataloged the items, they did it like a museum inventory. relics of a criminal life too big to disappear, even when the man behind it tried so hard to. 800,000 in cash, a dozen weapons, countless identities, but there was no escape map. No grand plan, just a man who had run long enough. And maybe, somewhere in that pile of money and metal, he had finally buried the illusion of control. The hallway smelled like dust and old cooking oil. Faded paint peeled from the door frame. Just another quiet building in Santa Monica. But this one held a ghost. And when the agents moved in, they weren't sure if he'd go for the gun or go quietly. They knocked. The door opened. He was standing there, calm, white hair, sun-darkened skin, a slight stoop in his posture that hadn't been there the last time anyone had seen him. He looked like someone's retired uncle, not the most wanted man in America. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't protest. He didn't smile, not really. But there was something in his eyes like he'd been expecting them, maybe for years, maybe since the day he first disappeared. The agent said his name. He didn't flinch. Then came the sound. That cold, metallic click. The handcuffs. Small circles of steel that had waited nearly 2 decades to meet his wrists. He didn't resist. They walked him out through the hallway. Past the neighbors who had known him as a polite man who always paid his rent on time. Past the palms swaying in the breeze. Past the life he had built on lies. The sun was hot. The sidewalk cracked. The world hadn't stopped while he was gone, but for a moment, it paused. He was no longer a myth, no longer a story told in hushed tones or a shadow flickering across grainy photographs. The man who vanished had a pulse again, a name, a face, and a pair of cuffs around his wrists. News traveled fast. Phones lit up in newsrooms. Reporters scrambled to confirm. Whitey Bulger had been caught. After 19 years, the hunt was over, and the reckoning could begin. For the agents, it was the end of a chapter. For his victims' families, it was a door cracked open, though not nearly wide enough. Justice doesn't erase absence, but it makes the silence answerable. As the black SUV pulled away with him in the back seat, the weight of the years caught up. He had changed his name, his hair, his location, but the past had followed, always. The cuffs didn't just bind his hands, they stitched time back together, the missing years, the broken lives. The questions left to rot in courtrooms and kitchen tables. The cuffs made it real. Whitey Bulger wasn't a ghost anymore. He was back. He sat there like a statue, almost smug, cleaned up, glasses on, white hair combed back. But nothing could soften what the courtroom knew. The man in the defendant's chair was not a retired old soul. He was a killer, a traitor, a ghost pulled back into the light. The trial of James Whitey Bulger began in the summer of 2013, but it felt like decades crashing down at once. Families who had waited through funerals and headlines and vanishing acts finally got their day. Mothers, sons, wives. They sat in rows behind the prosecution, clutching photographs and memories. Some stared daggers, others shook. No one forgot. The charges were staggering: racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and 19 murders. Each one came with a name, a date, a silence that had lived too long. And for each, the courtroom became a stage for pain. Witnesses came forward. Some were survivors. Others were former friends, now flipping with immunity deals and tired eyes. Stevie Flemmi, once his closest partner, took the stand and called Whitey a liar, a manipulator, a murderer. Their bond shattered, laid bare under oath. The stories spilled out like gasoline. Men shot in the head over whispers. Women strangled because they knew too much. Corpses buried in shallow graves or stuffed in basements while children played overhead. Cold, precise, cruel. Whitey never looked shaken. He scoffed, whispered to his lawyers, wrote notes in tight script. He denied being an informant more than he denied being a killer. In his twisted code, snitching was worse than murder. The prosecution laid out the decades of carnage, while the defense played a strange hand. Yes, He did terrible things, but not all of them. Yes, people died, but not like that. The jury watched, listened, took notes. Outside, the media swarmed like it was a movie premiere. But for the victims, this was no script. This was real. Each day was another wound reopened, another ghost reintroduced. One woman cried while describing how her father disappeared one winter morning and was never seen again until the body surfaced years later in a marsh, teeth missing. The weight of it all didn't fall at once. It built, like pressure behind a dam. The truth couldn't undo the crimes, but it could name them. And naming mattered. When the closing arguments echoed through the chamber, the silence afterward was heavier than the words. Whitey sat still, unmoved, but the world had changed. He had finally been seen. Not as a legend, not as a neighborhood Robin Hood, but as what he truly was. The trial was not just for justice, it was for memory. They stood, one by one, behind the courtroom podium. Voices trembling, eyes wet, hands clutching letters, photographs, or just empty air. For many, this moment had been rehearsed in their minds for years. What would they say to the man who had stolen a father, a brother, a daughter? What words could ever be enough? The courtroom was quiet, not the kind of silence that waits, but the kind that mourns. This was not evidence or cross-examination. This was pain. Whitey Bulger sat at the defense table, hands folded, jaw tight. The same eyes that once surveyed streets like a king now stared forward, dead and unreadable. He did not bow his head. He did not blink. The first woman who spoke had lost her son in the 1970s. He had worked as a mechanic, took a wrong job with the wrong people. She had waited years before anyone told her he was found buried beneath a Southie basement, his hands bound. She looked right at Whitey and said, "You knew his name, but I want you to remember mine too." Another voice, older, cracked with age and years of grief, belonged to a brother who never stopped looking. His sister, he said, trusted the wrong man. She never came home. For decades, their mother left the porch light on, thinking maybe one day. When her body was found in a shallow grave, there was no headline, just a call. "You made us live like ghosts," the man said. "But you're the one who should haunt yourself." There were sons who grew up without fathers, husbands who never got to say goodbye, friends who heard gunshots but never saw justice until now. And through it all, Whitey sat unmoving, his face a stone mask. He did not offer apologies, not to the old woman with the cane who called him a coward, not to the man who whispered that he once looked up to him as a protector, not to the girl whose mother was strangled and buried so deep that it took half a lifetime for the earth to give her back. Catherine Grieg sat behind him, holding back tears of her own. She had shared years of hiding with this man. She knew the tenderness he was capable of, the long walks, the quiet dinners. But now she heard the other truth, what happened in basements, in trunks, in cold silence after screams. Some families brought letters, read them aloud like prayers. Others spoke off script, raw and ragged. One man, shaking with fury, leaned forward and shouted, "You're not a legend, you're a disease." The judge allowed it. Everyone needed space to speak, and still, Whitey did not flinch. Maybe he thought silence was strength. Maybe he believed the mythology he had built around himself, the noble outlaw, the necessary evil. Maybe the truth was simpler. He just didn't care. But the words still landed. Not on him, perhaps, but on the courtroom walls, on the record, on the generations that would come after. The survivors had names. Their pain had shape. Their voices, for once, were louder than his legacy. And when the last victim's family sat down, there was nothing left to say. Only the weight of everything that had already been said. It happened late in the trial, when most believed the show was over. The evidence had been laid bare. Testimonies had filled the room like smoke, choking every inch with memory and grief. Whitey had sat still through it all, a marble statue in a cheap suit. But then, without warning, the silence broke. and the devil decided to speak. It was not remorse, not confession, not even self-defense. What came out of his mouth that day was venom, cold, targeted, and deliberate. He rose slowly, asked the judge to speak. The courtroom, stunned into stillness, waited. Cameras blinked, pens froze mid-word, and then he turned, not to the bench, not to the jury, but to the witness stand, toward a man who had once called him a brother, Kevin Weeks, former soldier. Now the prosecution's star witness. "You're a liar," Whitey said. "A rat, a Judas." The words echoed like a slap. For a man who once lived by a code, who preached loyalty like scripture, this was a public excommunication, and it was more than that. It was a declaration. The code, once sacred in Southie's back alleys and barrooms, had shattered. No more honor among thieves, just rats eating rats in the light of day. He kept going, called others weak, claimed they'd sold their souls to save their skins, said he'd never ratted, never not once. The feds lied, the papers lied, I was never one of them. It was a desperate rewriting of history, a final act of self-mythologizing. He had sat in the dark for so long that perhaps he truly believed he could reshape the story with his voice alone. The courtroom didn't buy it. The prosecution didn't flinch. But something had cracked not just in the story, but in the man himself. Until then, Whitey had controlled the silence like a weapon. But once he opened his mouth, the illusion collapsed. People saw through it. He wasn't some rogue outlaw who played both sides. He wasn't Robin Hood in a leather jacket. He was a killer with a badge in his back pocket. And now, without the shadows to hide him, all that remained was bitterness and bile. One reporter whispered it later that day. The mask just fell. And indeed, it had. The moment he spoke, everything he built, fear, mystery, control, dissolved. Not with a bang, but with a sneer. There was no apology to the families, no acknowledgement of pain, just attacks, just noise. A last, sour attempt to rewrite the ending. But the room didn't follow. The jury didn't blink. The people he called out, they'd already told their truth, and now the world had heard it. The code was dead. And with it, the man who once ruled the streets by it. The courtroom held its breath. It had been holding it for weeks. Now, the moment had arrived, not with drama, not with shouts or chaos, but with the calm gravity of justice landing like a stone on a quiet pond. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Some looked down, some stared straight ahead, but not one of them glanced at Whitey, and he didn't look at them either. He sat there, arms folded, jaw set, a man who still believed perhaps that none of this could touch him, that somehow he would walk away, that the legend was bigger than the law. The foreman stood. The judge asked for the verdict. And then it came, in a voice as clear as church bells on a cold winter morning. Guilty. Guilty on racketeering. Guilty on extortion. Guilty on drug trafficking. Guilty on money laundering. Guilty on murder, 11 counts confirmed, more hovering like ghosts unspoken. Whitey didn't flinch. Not a wince, not a blink. His face was carved in granite. But inside, something must have twisted, because that was the end. Not a bullet, not a back alley, not a final standoff with guns drawn in the dark. Just a room full of strangers, deciding that his time was over. When the sentence was read, life, again and again, stacked like bricks, there was no outburst, no last word, no apology, just silence. A silence that said, I still don't care. He had played judge, jury, and executioner for decades. And now he'd been judged, sentenced, locked away, and still, not 1 ounce of remorse. Reporters later said it was chilling, the way he looked at the judge. Not angry, not scared, just blank. Like the whole thing bored him. Like prison was just another address. The only reaction came from the back of the courtroom, families of the victims. Some cried, some nodded. Some stared at him like they were trying to burn his face into memory one last time. They had waited so long, years, in some cases, decades, waited for this man to be dragged out of the shadows and made to answer. And even if he never begged, even if he never broke, they had the verdict. They had the truth spoken aloud. Afterward, as marshals led him away, someone called out, a name, a daughter, a reminder of who was missing. Whitey didn't turn, didn't look back, because in the end, he was still Whitey Bulger, cold, silent, unapologetic, but no longer untouchable. Now he was just a number, just another lifer in a cell. Another ghost of what once was, and the city of Boston, still wounded, still remembering, could finally exhale. He was no longer the king of South Boston, no longer the man who made jurors flinch and agents look the other way. Now he was just inmate number whatever they gave him, processed and housed like any other convict. He wore beige instead of black. Concrete walls replaced the city skyline, and the echo of steel doors locking behind him was the only applause left. They moved him through the system like contraband. First one prison, then another. Too high profile, too dangerous, too hated. Every stop whispered with risk. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a trophy, a warning, a curse. Guards knew who he was, so did the inmates. Some saw a legend, others saw a rat. And in prison, being both was a death sentence waiting for its hour. At one point, they stashed him in Florida. Hot air, palm trees, and a cage lined with men who remembered bodies in trunks and payoffs gone bad. Then to Arizona, then Oklahoma. Each time, the same pattern. Rumors spread, pressure built, tension snapped. He'd done too much, crossed too many, and left behind a trail soaked in blood. Some men behind those bars had lost brothers, friends, fathers to the man now locked a few feet away. He kept to himself, old now, slower, but still sharp-eyed, still calculating. He read books, answered no questions, spoke to almost no one, but you could feel it the way time curled around him. A man used to being in control now reduced to head counts and meal trays. He walked the yard with hands behind his back, chin high, as if daring someone to come at him. Some days, it seemed he almost welcomed it. Even behind bars, he didn't stop making enemies. Other inmates whispered that he gave looks those cold, appraising looks that once preceded a hit. But here, that power didn't exist. Here, he had no Stevie Flemmy at his side, no FBI lifeline on speed dial, no safe houses, no vaults under church pews, just bars and men with long memories. His name still meant something on the outside. Documentaries, books, news specials. They called him the last great gangster, the blueprint of corruption, the myth made real. But inside, that name was poison. He wasn't feared. He was hunted. And slowly, the walls closed in. Because the longer you live in a place like that, the more the past catches up. It doesn't care how long you ran, doesn't care who protected you. In prison, there are no ghosts, only debts. And Whitey had built his empire on both. He could still feel it, sometimes. The power, the thrill, but it didn't matter anymore. Not in this place. Here, the only currency was time. And for the first time in his life, Whitey Bulger had too much of it. In the fall of the year 2018, an old man in a wheelchair was rolled into Hazleton Federal Penitentiary in West Virginia. He had thinning white hair, pale skin like paper, and the guarded expression of someone who had learned long ago never to trust a smile. On the paperwork, he was just another aging inmate, James Joseph Bulger. But inside those walls, the name carried weight and danger. It had been a quiet transfer. No press release, no headlines, just one of many inmate relocations that happen every week. But the guards knew, the inmates definitely knew. Word spreads fast in prison, and this wasn't just any transfer. This was the man who had built an empire by betrayal, who had left corpses in freezers and paychecks in agents' pockets. This was Whitey. Hazleton was no nursing home. It was a violent prison, nicknamed Misery Mountain by those trapped inside. Stabbings, gang wars, corruption. It had a reputation, a bad one. And Whitey was rolled right into it, like a lit match into dry grass. People asked questions. Why here? Why now? Why would the Bureau of Prisons send a notorious informant to a place like this, where retribution wasn't a possibility, it was a promise? He didn't even last a full day. Within hours, he was found beaten to death in his cell. Eyes gouged, tongue nearly severed. So brutal, so personal, it didn't feel like a killing. It felt like a message. A final act of vengeance delivered by men who had been waiting for their moment. Rumors spiraled. Some said the killers were tipped off ahead of time, that the cell doors had been left unlocked, that guards turned a blind eye, that the whole thing had been orchestrated from the top, or at least allowed to happen. It was hard to prove, but easy to believe. One of the men accused was a mob hitman from Massachusetts, someone who had grown up in the shadow of Whitey's terror. Another had ties to organized crime. These weren't random inmates. These were men with history and motive. No warning, no chance, no guards around when it happened. Just silence, then blood. People asked how a man on 24-hour watch, with a long list of enemies, could be killed so quickly and viciously in a supposedly secure facility. But no answers came. The prison gave a statement. The FBI opened an investigation, but no one seemed eager to dig too deep. Because maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was the final page of a story that had dragged on too long. The end, not written by justice, but by vengeance. Whitey Bulger, the king of South Boston, the FBI's pet monster. The ghost who outlived his empire was gone. Not by trial, not by time, but by hands that had been waiting in the dark, waiting to finish what the law never truly did. There was no announcement, no riot, no shouting, just the dull metallic sound of a door closing, followed by silence that stretched too long. By the time the guards made their next check, the cell was a crime scene. James Whitey Bulger, once the most feared man in Boston, lay crumpled on the concrete floor, beaten beyond recognition. His body still, his face destroyed. His killers didn't use guns or knives. They used a padlock and a sock. It was crude. It was brutal. And it was effective. The guards would later say it happened quickly, maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. He had been in Hazleton less than a full day. The transfer paperwork wasn't even cold. The ink, not dry. Yet, the clock had already run out. The weapon, a sock filled with metal, was common in prison. It didn't make noise like a blade. It didn't raise alarms like a shiv, but it crushed. It pulverized. And with enough swings, it erased faces. That was what they used. That was how they did it. There were rumors that the attackers had waited for him, that they knew he was coming, that someone, somewhere, made sure they were in the right unit, at the right time, with no cameras watching. Bulger had enemies, sure, but this felt choreographed, like a hit, not a fight. They smashed his head until it caved. One eye was gone. His tongue nearly torn out. Not just violence, but symbolism. The kind of retribution reserved for rats, for traitors, for those who broke a sacred code. No warning was given, no chance to scream. The man who once ruled South Boston with a whisper of fear died surrounded by cinder block and shadows. A king, reduced to a statistic in a prison report. The official story came quick. The Bureau of Prisons released a statement. Death under investigation. Suspects questioned. But behind the words was a wall of silence, the kind that surrounds old debts, old blood, old names that still echo through dark hallways. One of the accused was a hitman from Massachusetts, doing time for mob murders. Another had ties to organized crime, not random, not accidental. These men didn't just know of Whitey, they knew what he had done, who he had betrayed, what his silence had cost. Some called it justice, others called it failure. But whatever it was, it came without a trial. A prison guard later told a reporter that it was like watching a ghost get dragged back to earth. Like history, finally catching up. Whitey Bulger didn't die in a blaze of gunfire. He didn't go out in a courtroom or surrounded by lawyers. He died alone in a concrete box, under fists and fury, with a padlock swinging from the end of a sock. That's how the story ended. Not with forgiveness, not with redemption, just a lock, a sock, and a silence that said everything. It was not just murder, it was punctuation, a final, violent period at the end of a story soaked in blood. When they found Whitey Bulger's body in his cell, it was not the broken bones or crushed skull that turned stomachs. It was the deliberate cruelty. Eyes gouged out, tongue sliced nearly clean. This wasn't rage, it was ritual. Whoever did it wanted the world to understand. This was not random, not a fight over commissary or a clash of tempers. It was a message, written in pain, delivered with the same lack of mercy Whitey had shown in basements and back alleys across decades. To gouge out a man's eyes is not just to kill him, it is to erase his gaze, to say, "You don't get to look at this world anymore. You saw too much. You saw what you were not supposed to. And worse, you told." It is the oldest punishment in the book of men who speak when they should have stayed silent. And the tongue cut, mangled, nearly severed was no accident either. It was the mark of a snitch. It was the street's ancient judgment on betrayal. A traitor's mouth loses its voice, forever. There were whispers even before the body was cold, that it had been planned, that the prison move had been no coincidence, that doors had been left unlocked, guards turned away, surveillance cameras conveniently blinked out at the right moment. No alarms, no struggle. Just 3 men in a cell with an 89-year-old man whose past had finally caught up. Whitey, for all his brutality, had lived almost mythically. He had disappeared, outwitted the law, humiliated the FBI, and returned like a ghost. He had glared across courtroom benches at families he had destroyed, daring them to flinch. He had refused to apologize, refused to bend, but in the end, he broke. And what they did to him wasn't just death, it was theater, mob theater. It was the kind of execution that carried memory, the kind that survivors whispered about years later, after drinks and long silences, the kind that said, codes still matter, even now. They wrapped it in bureaucracy. The official reports read like a checklist: blunt force trauma, facial disfigurement, cause of death pending. But the language missed the truth. This was not simply vengeance. This was a reckoning. A reckoning delivered not by courts, not by laws, but by men who understood exactly what Whitey had been and what he had broken. No cameras, no footage, just a blood-slicked floor, a sock gone rigid with bone and steel, and the unmistakable finality of justice as it is defined by those who never believed in mercy. And so, the man who once made others disappear, who silenced witnesses with bullets and fear, died with his eyes carved from his face and his tongue laid out like a warning. This was not about forgiveness. This was about the last rule being followed. And for Whitey Bulger, it was the only ending that made sense. The cell is quiet now. Just steel, stone, and a number that no longer answers roll call. The blood has long been scrubbed clean, the bunk stripped, the walls repainted. But listen closely, something lingers. Echoes. Not of footsteps, not of voices, but of a question that won't die. Was Whitey Bulger just one man's evil? Or was he a mirror held up to a much deeper rot? They say he was a monster, and he was. Cold, calculating, capable of horrors most men can't imagine. But he didn't rise from nowhere. He was fed, trained, rewarded, protected, not by shadows but by institutions, by badges, by silence, by the thin gray line between order and chaos that got blurred for the sake of control. Think about it. How many years did he walk free, not in spite of the law, but because of it? How many deals were made behind closed doors? How many pages of truth shredded? How many lives traded like poker chips at a table no one admits exists? Was Whitey their tool or their Frankenstein? The men who made those deals called it strategy. They said it was about catching bigger fish, dismantling worse threats. But the truth? They handed him a license to kill, so long as he delivered. And he delivered. Until he didn't. Until he slipped the leash, turned the table, and made them all look like fools. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a collaborator. And when that collaboration became inconvenient, they looked the other way. For decades. So, what does that make him? A demon in human skin? Or a symptom of something no one wants to name? Something that lives in the crawlspace of power itself. The belief that rules can be bent if the ends justify it, that monsters can be managed, and that secrets can stay buried. But nothing stays buried forever. Whitey is gone now, murdered in silence, files closed, careers salvaged, statues still standing. But behind the headlines, behind the courtroom drama, behind the revenge soaked in blood, that question whispers on. Was he the disease, or the cure that became worse than the sickness? Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Maybe justice, if you want to call it that, arrived late and brutal. But if we stop asking how he got that far, how he was allowed to rot the center from within, then we've learned nothing. Then we've buried more than a body. Close your eyes. Picture that cell, the silence, the absence, the legacy carved into a dozen families and 1,000 lies. Whitey's not speaking anymore, but the system still is, and it's still afraid of what you might ask next.